Section 21 evictions. Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Ms Noakes, and it's a pleasure to speak with you in the chair. I realise when you're in a minority of one, you're probably not necessarily wrong, but it probably increases the chances of you being wrong. So I'm probably going to swim against the tide of some of the speeches we might hear in this debate today. But and before I make my comments, I'd like to there is a problem here in the private rented sector, there's no doubt. And I think everybody would like to see people who do want to live in accommodation longer term should have a solution to be able to do that. But I'd just like to take the House, if I can, back to 1985. Myself, a young estate agent in York, a relatively young estate agent in York. If you wanted to rent a property back then, you had a very limited choice, probably 3 or 4 quite dark, quite shabby two-bedroom terraced house off Bishopthorpe Road in York. There was so little choice back then. And the reason was we didn't have a Section 21. The reason was then if you rented a property out, if you invested in the private rented sector, if you're a landlord and somebody occupied your property, they did that effectively permanently if that's what they wanted to do. Now, a House might think that's a really good idea and the solution to our problems. I just really fear that would lead to many unintended consequences, as it did back then. Because back then you did have rent controls, and he may say that's a really good thing, having rent controls. But to me, you will end up putting layer and layer of legislation on top of what he's thinking to do, what the government's thinking to do now in terms of abolition of Section 21, which will lead to more and more regulation, which will lead to less and less supply, which is ultimately very counter. Well, he shakes his head, but that's the reality of the mid-1980s. Yes, I'm happy to give way.
I know we're not here to talk primarily about rent controls, but rent controls go back to at least 1915. But on the Section 21, I think he may be flogging a dead horse. I don't know if you've seen the National Residential Landlords Association briefing for today, but they say in that 70% of landlords could envisage operating without Section 21, and another 8% say it had never been important to them in the first place. So if he's defending the landlord's cause, they may have accommodated the government and our position already.
Well, I've seen that briefing like he has. That does mean effectively somewhere between 20 and 30% of supply might go overnight or go very quickly. And we've seen this in Scotland. Well, you can check his head, but it's a reality. We've seen this in Scotland, a reduction in supply on the back of abolition of Section 21, followed by rent controls. Back then in York in the mid-1980s, what the government's saying it will happen is...
Order. I do think the honourable gentleman, I don't mean this with any malicion, but should declare, make reference to his register of interest.
I appreciate that. You could have made an intervention. I would have responded, yes, you're absolutely right. I draw the House's attention to my register of members' interest. For many years, I owned an estate agency lettings business, which I don't own anymore, but I do have a couple of, I think, 4 private rented properties in the private rented sector. But I absolutely do not speak on my behalf. I speak of anything here on behalf of tenants, because I think these measures would lead to a reduction in supply, which is ultimately massively counterproductive for tenants. And that's the conversation we should be having around, is this good or is it not good for tenants? If you'll just indulge me a second in terms of some of his points. I know he's shaking his head there, but probably just listen to my points might be useful. As well as rent controls that applied back then, and it's not as if you sent rent controls according to market value, because there was no market value at that point. As soon as you introduce rent controls, you effectively get rid of market values. That's what happens. So you can only, the rent officers back then would only compare it with other properties that were being rented out, none of which were accessible by the open market. So rent controls do actually take this away from a free market completely. Also, what the government's saying is, okay, we'll allow landlords to do is to, if they need to reoccupy that property or they want to sell it, we'll allow them to do that and basically ask the tenant to leave on that basis. But that loophole was closed as well. And this loophole will be closed again, because what happened back then, if you wanted to ask that tenant to leave, I'll just finish this point now, Will. You asked that tenant to leave, you had to find another house for them. You had to provide them with another house because they didn't want that to be used as a backdoor to getting that tenant out. Yep.
I just want to ask my honourable friend, whether to bring the debate back to what it is on, which is the merits of ending Section 21 evictions. Does he think his government should deliver on the promises it's made, or does he think they should backtrack on them?
My speech is very much in the context of Section 21, in that this will not be the end of the measures. I don't think abolishing Section 21, certainly without more measures in terms of how we deal with Section 8, which is the other mechanism getting to grips with difficult tenants, which aren't just difficult in terms of the landlord, let's not forget, the difficulty in terms of communities. 50% of Section 21 notices are basically used to get people out who are guilty of either criminal behaviour or antisocial behaviour. So let's not forget what the impact of these measures he's considering will have on local communities. Because Section 8, I've spoken to every single government minister about these, my opposition to some of these plans. So the trouble with Section 8 is using the court-based process. It currently takes around 8 months to get somebody out of a property using Section 8. So somebody is guilty of antisocial behaviour, or somebody's well behind the rent, and you can't take these measures. You can't take any of these measures until somebody is about 2 months behind in the rent. It will take months. Now, if you're illegal in general, or you're a Granger, or you're a Physio Living, or whatever, that isn't such much of a problem, because you've got thousands of properties, so that if one tenant, if you've got a few dodgy tenants, you can blend that problem against your whole estate, and that will happen. Of course, you blend the problem because of the whole estate, so everybody pays for the tenants who make trouble and don't pay the rent or antisocial behaviour. But if you're a small landlord, and I like it when the opposition talk about business, because they always talk about small business. I do too, SMEs. But if you're basically saying if you do this, lots of SME landlords will exit the market, because if you've got 1 or 2 properties and you've got a tenant in that property and they don't pay their rent for 8 months for whatever reason, that can be devastating in terms of that investment. So lots of SMEs will exit the marketplace, particularly if you abolish Section 21 without first putting in place the reforms of the court-based process. The reality is, what we saw when we saw in 1988, when the Section 21 measures were introduced in the Housing Act of 1988, we saw a massive increase in supply. And that's been very good for tenants. The reality is, most yields on properties in most parts of the country are pretty low in terms of return on capital invested. So you're looking at a rental yield of 2 to 4%. So particularly when interest rates now are, if you want to borrow money, it's going to be 5-6% and higher. Most landlords are not getting an annual return based on if they're borrowing money to buy properties like this. It's not as if most landlords are profiteering from the private rented sector. Far from it. Absolutely.
Thank him for giving way on that point. The point that he's just making then is he then suggesting that it's appropriate for people who are living in rented accommodation to be subject to the vagaries of the market. We're talking about people who live their lives in these homes. What exactly does he envisage they will do in this scenario?
Well, it's a very interesting point, because the vast majority of people in the private rented sector are happy with a shorter term nature of rented accommodation. No, please don't share. Just listen to what I have to say. There are a cohort of people that do want to live in rented accommodation permanently and treat that as their family home and live throughout the entirety of their family. I absolutely agree that the government should be providing accommodation to those people. It should be providing the much larger investment that they're currently providing in terms of long-term affordable rented accommodation and social rented accommodation. That's definitely the government's job where you have that market failure. And I concede there are market failures for people who want to live in permanent rented accommodation. So I'm not against the government stepping in and doing that. But I think if you step in and tell the private rented sector to do that, and these are the rules that apply now to you if you want to make an investment in the private rented sector, the reality is what you'll get is a reduction in investment in the private rented sector, which will mean a reduction in supply, which will make it more difficult for tenants that you are speaking on behalf of. That's the reality of this situation. So yes, we should make a higher public investment in the long-term rental accommodation to deal with this, but we shouldn't dictate to landlords who use their private money to invest in the private rented sector that they have to let their property for life, which is what you are considering. The other way of dealing with this, if you want the private rented sector to do that, is by offering incentives for them to do that. So either look at capital gains tax, so if people were willing to rent their property for a much longer period of time, 5, 10 years, maybe even for life, would get beneficial capital gains tax treatment, for example. Or we could reverse some of the changes we made in 2015 in the Finance Act, where we restricted mortgage interest on private rented sector, which was pretty damaging for lots of landlords in the private rented sector. If we said to landlords, actually now we're not limiting your interest, the way you can deduct interest against your rental annual rental income, then as long as you're willing to rent your property out for longer and for life, to give the security of tenure to those kind of tenants. The other unintended consequence you can get with this, and I'll conclude very shortly, Ms. Noakes, is you're going to get the landlords of private rented sector are going to prioritise the best tenants. They're not going to take a risk because of the concerns about non-payment of rent. So you're actually going to disadvantage the people you seek to protect by what measures the government's planning here and the opposition that... I am ever so sorry. That's the first time I've ever done that in this place in 7 years. So I apologise for doing that. So the people he seeks to protect. So all those reasons, and I'm fully convinced the government's going to push ahead with this, and the opposition will double down on it if it ever gets into our place in government. But I'm saying, be careful what you wish for, because I think this would be very damaging for the people